Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audience across the pond. This is the Saturday Free Show here at This is Revolution Podcast, and I am your host, Jason Miles. So glad to be here with you today. If you are a returning listener, subscriber, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, hope you enjoyed the show. If you do like what you see, make sure to hit like and subscribe on your way out. It is a passive gesture that goes a very long way. So usually we have lighter Saturday shows. Today, probably not so much. But if the show does get too heavy, too depressing, as you people say, I promise I have some videos in the chamber that we can watch that will definitely lighten the mood a little bit. If it works, it is the perfect explanation of the Damien and Rufus dynamic. I have found the video that will explain it, the explainer video for the Damien Rufus dynamic. But let's get to the topic at hand. Homelessness and tough on crime legislation. As fear of property crime and visible homelessness rise in major metropolitan cities like San Francisco, New York, of course, Los Angeles, their Democratic mayors are increasingly turning to punitive remedies that are reminiscent of the 1990s to address these complex challenges. In the 90s, cities across the United States implemented stringent tough on crime policies aimed at reducing crime rates through aggressive policing, harsh sentencing, and zero tolerance approaches to minor offenses. The three strikes law came out during the 90s, and it was looked at as a common sense solution to what people felt was a broken criminal justice system. While these measures, like three strikes, were credited with lowering crime rates, they also led to mass incarceration, disproportionately affecting marginalized communities, and often criminalized poverty without addressing its root causes. It seems crazy that only 4 years ago, people were out en masse to protest the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by overzealous law enforcement. The protests have ended, and the demands of the demos have shifted from defund, abolish the police to we need more cops. What has brought about this paradigmatic shift? Today, we are witnessing a troubling revival of these policies. The visible increase in homelessness and a frightening shift in news coverage to property crime and smash and grab robberies have fueled public anxiety, prompting political leaders to revert to familiar yet controversial tactics. This resurgence includes heightened police presence, stricter enforcement of minor infractions, and policies that push homeless individuals out of public spaces without offering sustainable solutions. I can't find my glasses. That's my excuse. San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles are at the forefront of this trend. In these cities, the fear of crime is compounded by a housing crisis that leaves many without shelter and support. Attempting to address the systemic issues of affordable housing, mental health care, and economic inequality can take years to see positive effects. It's easier to quell voter fears if politicians simply call to lock people up and stockpile homeless citizens away where no one has to see their plight. City officials are opting for short-term fixes that prioritize public perception over substantive change. Today, I'll be speaking with writer and journalist Matthew Vernon Whalen. I wrote his name down wrong originally, and he sent me a text message to correct my. It's like, nah, bro, it's not the pen name. You got my rap name wrong. It's YBG Matt. You need to refer to me as YBG Matt. Please welcome. He's written extensively on the incarcerated and works with the unhoused currently. Please welcome Matthew Vernon Whalen.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you for coming on. And also big shout out to Ben Burgess for hooking up this meeting of the minds, if you will. Ben and I were talking over tacos as we normally do here in Mexico, and he mentioned you, and he said, "You know, when I go home, I'm going to introduce you guys," and definitely he did, and instantaneously we met up, and this was serendipitous as I was going to do this show alone, and I was like, "I can talk
Nice.
to man about this show," so that was pretty awesome.
Great. Big fan of Ben.
My neighbor, huh? Big fan of Ben.
Yeah, big fan. He probably
Everybody's always a big fan of Ben.
can hear me through the wall right now.
he's he's far enough now. He's got a 3-minute jaunt over here. It's no
Alright,
longer.
let me tell you what I really think. No.
Tell us a little bit about your work, Matthew, for those that don't know.
Yeah, so I've been a writer and in recent years, an oral historian for many years. In the past several years, I've mostly focused on um, prisons and homelessness, a little less so increasingly, but I wrote investigative journalism about prisons, mostly in Alabama, and oral lots of oral histories and some reporting about homelessness in the Northeast, mainly in Vermont, um, for the past several years. So, and I guess my work mainly prioritizes sources on the ground, telling the stories of the people on the ground. Obviously, almost exclusively in the oral history, but also even in the reporting, the essays, the journalism type work. I try to center the stories of the people experiencing the issues. And I noticed early on in my reporting, I guess, that there are lots of officials, public officials of different departments, or elected officials, or community partners, community agencies of various kinds, who are quoted and interviewed on these issues, and sometimes at the exclusion of the people that the issues are about. Um,
Give us an example of that.
so we'll take homelessness, for example.
Mhm.
In the town I was writing in at the time, um, called Brattleboro, Vermont. One of the main reasons that I guess, started writing about the issues and interviewing about the issues was that I noticed that in the local newspapers, there were lots of articles related to um, the homeless issue in town, in various different ways. Some would be about, should we move this shelter, and if we move it, where are we going to move it? Debates about the location. What are we going to do about the panhandling problem? People standing on the street asking for money. Um, and you would see, here's what the people who live in the neighborhood where the shelter might go think about this. Here's what the agency that runs the shelter thinks about this. Here's what various social workers think about this in the community. Here's what, let's say the church thinks about it at the community, in some cases because they were sheltering people, because this agency didn't have its own shelter space for a period. And when it comes to panhandling, it would be like, here's what the business owners think
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
panhandling. Here's what the police think about it. Here's what people who showed up to town meeting think about it, or the local select board members think about it. But typically, panhandlers were not interviewed. The people who were going to be staying at those shelters were not interviewed. And so there was a very narrow scope of discussion, I thought, in the local public discourse as a result of that. And also, I would say, and I have a tendency to go on too long, so interrupt me at any time.
Mhm.
I would also point out that uh, I think the public discourse also suffered it became slightly less sophisticated as a result. This is an area that is fairly progressive, liberal, at least largely thinks of itself that way. Is pretty accepting of others, tolerant, I think people would use the word. Um, but when it comes to homeless people, it's just not the case. I mean, you'd see, in one of the introductions to one of my books, I pointed out that there were lots of articles about, like I said earlier, like you'd have an article titled like the panhandling problem. And, you'd have business owners or whatever quoted about what they think about it. And I recommended in the book, like to, go through some of those articles and just replace the word panhandler with like any other group of person. And I think that like most people in the community, I hope, would find it problematic.
Like if you said the Irish.
Yeah,
The Irish keep asking for money.
yeah. There's all of a sudden, there's an influx of Irish in town, and uh, I don't like seeing them around. I'm scared of them. Uh, um, and they make me uncomfortable. They make it hard for me to operate my business. The uh, just take any other group, the Mexicans or the Jews are making it hard for me to operate my business. I don't like them hanging
We can't even joke about that because of all the
outside my store.
anti-Semitism on the show that we usually have. So we can't even joke about Jews.
Sorry about
Very fine people, the Jews.
that. Yeah.
They don't. We're not even joking about you because you're so fine people. Please don't
Yeah.
cancel us. We saw what you guys did to Breonna Joy Gray.
But, just imagine like newspaper articles in your local town newspaper saying that, you know, business owners in town are upset about the number of whatever group hanging around outside their storefronts or whatever.
Irish Jews. We can joke about Irish Jews.
I think, um, I'd hope that would be unpalatable even to most of the people who are saying these things or reporting these things. And so, and it's similar, prisoners face different barriers um, to getting their stories out, but often still in local newspaper. And there are some reporters actually that do a really good job, even local reporters uh, who I know and do a pretty great job of getting the prisoners' perspectives in their stories. I would say slightly more common than with homeless people, but still, prisoners face various barriers to getting their stories out, perhaps for obvious reasons.
I mean, do you think though that people do want to talk to homeless people and prisoners whenever it's a story about scandal, i.e., um, let's say there's a corrupt warden, everybody can't wait to talk to a prisoner, or maybe there's a guard scandal like we had at Corcoran Prison, and that's how you pronounce it, in the 90s, I think the late 80s, 90s, where they were actually doing like a fight club where they would get people from different rival gangs when the gangs were really a problem. Sorry, Kendrick Lamar. He didn't really do much. But get gangs when they were really a problem and like make them fight. And they were recording it. It was bad. Of course you want to talk to prisoners then. If you want to talk to homeless people when, maybe you want to show that a nonprofit is mishandling funds, they can't wait to talk to homeless people then. Or for example, there's a gentleman that works with the unhoused and has for decades in San Francisco, and the Examiner ran an insane hit piece on him. And as you know, for someone that's worked inside permanent supportive housing, it's a challenge. Depending on if you're dealing with a brand new building or an older building, and San Francisco is an old city for our West Coast standards, an older city, and you're dealing with much older buildings. You also don't have a lot of help in maintaining the buildings, and you're also dealing with the most vulnerable of a population that gets inside said building. So people that haven't had shelter, people that have severe mental illness. And I think we have to be honest from the jump. There's only so much services that you're really giving people on an individual level, um, because there's so many issues that people have that have gone misdiagnosed. I think we were having a conversation about this the other day, and like autism is one of those things that if you're of a certain age, you weren't getting diagnosed with ADHD or autism. If you could function enough to have some basic skills, we'll throw you in a classroom literally to fail because we don't even know have like special education. And what happens to these people years later when a certain um aspect of society is gone, especially a deindustrialized America where you could be a high school dropout and still get a job and support a family, and all that's gone. So you are dealing with a segment of the population that gives no fuck sometimes about you know taking out the trash or fighting with your neighbor. It's a lot to deal with, and that I feel like is when reporters love shoving a mic in someone's face that probably shouldn't be speaking on
Mm.
behalf of a population. But I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying.
Yeah, I think also it's important to distinguish between the kinds of reporting. I mean, there's certainly uh, like local TV or online news reporting that just kind of follows around cops and, you know, uh, while they have, personal, while the cops interact with people who are experiencing personal crises and stuff. And, but in terms of, I guess, more traditional mainstream reporting, I would say, I would say 2 things going back to what you were saying at the beginning, about when people are suddenly interested in talking to prisoners.
Mhm.
Very hard to predict. I mean, first of all, the kinds of scandals that you're talking about, there might be reporters who take an interest in them, but, um, particularly like the example you gave at a nonprofit agency, I mean, it's I think unlikely that the scandal is exposed. I don't know if you're thinking of a specific example, I'm not, but I think,
Mm.
something being exposed like that in a nonprofit would less likely be exposed by a particular homeless person if a nonprofit mismanaged funds. And perhaps there would be a reporter interested in their perspective on that. But I would also say that particularly in the case of the prisons, there's just scandals ongoing all the time in their minds,
Yeah.
in the prisoners' minds, correctly, I think, with the wardens and every other aspect of the management of the prison systems. And it's extremely hard to predict when the state, when the media are going to take an interest in that. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Like, uh, I was writing my book on the prisons. I was writing a very different book on the prisons before the COVID outbreak took place, and like literally weeks passed before there were announcements in the Alabama newspapers, weeks after things like schools and other institutions shutting down, weeks passed before any announcements were even made. At one point, there was this horrifying story that was broken in, I think, either AL.com or Alabama Political Reporter about about somebody had leaked a DOC document memorandum or something about like what the plan would be if there were mass deaths in the prison system as a result of COVID. And this was before we knew, what populations, as much about what populations were most at risk and things like that. And it was pretty scary time. Like, we really thought like there could be, really unsustainable, to use that really unpalatable word in this situation, number of deaths in the prison system,
Mhm.
where the departments of corrections were talking about like the types of logistical problems that it would pose and how to solve them in some cases using prison labor. And um, Even in that initial story of that leak, if I remember correctly, it's years ago now, I'm happy to be wrong about this, but if I remember correctly, even that story, they did not interview a prisoner in that initial leaked, in this initial story about that leak. very difficult to predict when a particular crisis or scandal is going to trigger. I was pretty shocked
Mhm.
that I mean, I was totally by myself working on this. I did not have any income. I was in the process of losing my apartment. I just did it because I had an interest in it, and I happened to have, you know, connections to people on the ground going through it who I could learn more about it
Sounds
from.
like you were on the ground going through it.
I really felt like I was doing it because nobody else was, you
Yeah.
know? And my little, basically self-published book, I think was the first one about prisons in the pandemic in America.
You know, that was one of those things that I think we were all tuned to the television during the shelter in place, kind of like post 9/11 America. I know you're a little younger and you may not remember that time, but that's when the crawl on the screen gets invented. Because we're just all watching so much news. A lot of people watch Fox News, right? Um, I have a friend that works at a prison. I won't say which one. Um, and they had gotten a transfer of 2 people that were COVID positive, and all the guards had got with the warden and said, "Why don't we clear out the gym, put these cats here so they can be out of general population, and we'll have a few dudes, a few guards that'll just be their thing, right? And we can keep them out of the general population."
Yeah.
And the warden was like, "Nah." And it spread through this prison like wildfire. People were dying left and right. And it led to the state saying, well, maybe we should let some people out that, you know, have been sitting here on, they got good time. Every county in the immediate area said, we don't want these people free in this county.
Mhm.
So people that literally had served their time that were due to be released couldn't get out because there was nowhere for them to go.
Mhm.
Eventually, the death toll in this particular place was one of the highest in the country, I believe, per
Mhm.
capita. And it wasn't just the inmates, it was also guards that were dying pretty rapidly, to the point that people were quitting. Like, dude, we can't work here. And uh, it was getting to the point where he said, and he never really talks about his job. Never talks about his job. He said that you would have to pick who was going to live or who was going to die because there was like one ambulance that could take people to forget what county it was. And it's like, okay, well, there's 3 guys. We got room for one more. Who's it going to be?
Mhm.
And it was that bad there. And that got a little bit of coverage, but not a lot. I think there's these moments in time where we purport to have a little more humanity, right?
Mhm.
These crisis moments. Um, I look at the pandemic as one of the moments where people cared about the unhoused to the point where it's like we have to shelter these people. There's a population that literally is just out in the street. We have to figure out a way, and that's when we start getting brilliant and use all these vacant hotels. And but it was short lived.
Yeah, and I would say too, like I broke a story about Ventress prison in Alabama during the pandemic who did decide to uh house sick prisoners in the gym. And it wasn't as disastrous as what you're saying, but COVID still spread through the prison. And I also interviewed several prisoners who were in that gym. Um, and you know, that was pretty horrifying place to be too. So
Mhm.
um and so I think and then there's another problem that you touched on, which is there are many public health risks that prisons pose to society as they're constructed in the United States right now that uh, are true even if you hate criminals and want all those people in there or not,
Mhm.
and are also not things that I think people really think about very much. I mean, the healthcare system in the prisons is terrible and privatized and uh, operating at a very low budget,
Mhm.
uh, uh, in a very low budget way, dangerous way, I would say, in most cases. And also, the prisons are extremely overcrowded and the facilities are not well kept up with. And so, the possibility of illness spreading in a prison is extremely high. And then when you couple that with the fact that um, the most recent research I've read on this, I'm not sure if this has changed since the most recent research I read on this, but the most recent research I read on this shows that there's a similarity with police and prison guards, where police often don't live in the communities they work in.
Yeah.
They often live far away. The same
Yes.
thing happens to be true for prisons in many cases,
Yes.
which causes extra public health risks because particularly if you do have a pandemic that's as bad and widespread enough as COVID has been, um, the guards are not only contracting COVID and bringing it home, but they're bringing it to completely different communities that aren't even near the prison. They're basically uh, uh, a vessel through which to spread COVID throughout the country. Um, so that's very dangerous too. And that was pointed out, actually, that research was done about public health risks to COVID as they relate to and partly as they relate to the proximity with which prison guards live to the prisons. That research was done before COVID, so it
Mhm.
was pretty prescient in many ways.
I mean, I can only speak to what I know in California, having done extensive
And
work.
then when you couple that with the
Mhm.
fact that a lot of these really conservative states, the really red states, they also want to not do lockdowns for everybody else. So the conservative communities, they really, I mean, I'm not a public health expert, but it seems to me they came up with they landed on really the worst strategy for dealing with COVID, which is you keep the prisoners packed in together, you don't let them out, keep them
Mhm.
packed into these overcrowded, unsanitary, illness-inducing conditions, and let everybody else go free. That's a recipe for disaster, you know? It should have been the opposite, obviously. I mean, most listeners to
I
this.
mean, in this particular prison, it really was. I forget the number of people that died. Like I said, it wasn't just inmates; it was also staff as well. Um, it was just a mess there. My friend said it was the one time, and he's been there for 20 plus years. He said it was the one time that like guards and prisoners were all on the same page, because it then became a nightmare about like food. I don't know if the same thing happened in Alabama, where they just like, okay, we're going to take out all this food because we know no one knew how stuff was spread, so they could only eat packaged things, and it was like cheese and crackers,
Jeez, yeah,
you know. And the guards like, we can't give these people this, like that's effed up.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I mean, there are other instances of that during the strike as well. But another thing I would say is important to keep in mind, this maybe is a little bit off topic of the discussion, but I think it's worth noting that the distinction, lots of times nowadays, people will focus, I think, a little inordinately on private prisons. That's like the new scandal of the last 10 years or so in the discourse about American prisons, and um, it is important. There are real serious problems with lots of private prisons, and but they're also not a huge percentage of the prisons. And I think the more important distinction is that the more important point is that the distinction between these days, the state prison and the private prison, is very thin because even the state prisons, everything in them is privatized. The food
yeah.
is privatized, the food is privatized, the pest control is privatized, the construction and maintenance is privatized, the phones are privatized, the transportation of American prisoners is often privatized now, used to be done by US Marshals. Every aspect of their lives is privatized, and every aspect of the functioning of the uh, the prison itself is privatized. With you know the most important exception being prison labor.
Yeah.
That's the main thing they're not hiring outside companies for, but they're often still, in that case, using private companies to profit off of that prison labor. So even there's a relationship. Um,
Well, I think it is important to talk about prisons when we're talking about tough on crime laws and the unhoused, because I do think it's all connected.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
Especially because in the aftermath of 1994, we do understand that these tough on crime laws that were putting everybody uh, under the jail for long periods of time, especially I think 86 we have the 100-to-1 law, right? When it came to rock cocaine uh, and powder cocaine, because we viewed crack cocaine as the nemesis. And I kind of want to put that in a certain perspective. I do think there's a racialized component to it. I can't lie about that. But I also, as someone that grew up in that era, understand what it looked like on the ground, how violent it was. I feel like I can't stress it enough. The influx of cheap cocaine um, in urban areas like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, where I'm from, um, especially a place like Los Angeles that has distribution infrastructure already with gangs and redlined neighborhoods. Um, Crack houses were like the Amazon warehouses of the 90s, and it's where everybody worked. Um, and much like Amazon, in a deindustrialized city like Los Angeles, it's the employer of record.
Mhm.
So we have to remember that. And, when you're dealing in an illegal economy so far outside of the law, where there wasn't a lot of police presence in these areas.
Hmm.
So you're going to have more gunplay. These crack houses or warehouses are expensive pieces of property. These street corners are very expensive pieces of real estate. Um, change uh, drug dealer to land speculator, and that's really what you have in the 80s and 90s. And you don't have the ability of the courts to come in and help you, you know, take over these pieces of land. You just do it by sheer brute force. So I'm not trying to justify the 100-to-1 uh, rule. Just want to paint a picture of the era and continue to paint a picture of the mindset of citizens and politicians, because nothing much has changed even after we have data that says this doesn't work.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I had two thoughts as well. One goes back to something you were saying earlier about like people with like, learning disabilities or autism, mentally challenged, whatever it may be, mental health issues. I just want to note, because I won't go into it too much, there's a great book on that by Christine Montross called Waiting for an Echo, which really focuses on how people with mental health issues are policed in this country and imprisoned. And then I had a thought about what you're saying at the end there too. Uh, oh yeah, I guess this kind of goes back to a thought I had at the beginning, which was the title of the show is returning to a return to tough on crime.
Mhm.
I'm not really sure it ever went anywhere. You were saying something in your introduction I thought was interesting too, which was about something like the same people who were saying defund or abolish
Yeah.
the police are now. I'm not so sure that's the case, you know? I'm not so sure if it's the same people. I could be very wrong about that. You might have
I
very
can I'll speak look, dude, I'll speak for people in my state or my home state,
yeah,
and they definitely the same people that had, "In this house, trans people or people, defund the police," all those signs
yeah, yeah,
were the same ones calling the cops going, "There's a guy in the neighborhood in an RV
yeah,
on blocks on my block, I need it moved."
yeah, yeah,
It's like, "Oh, wow. Huh,
yeah.
interesting."
Yeah, and certainly, I'm sure that happens. I guess my impression was that the mainstream centrist Democratic politicians, um, regardless of whether one likes them or not, I didn't. I found that for the most part, and in fact, even the not so, even the more left ones like Bernie Sanders, like, I don't think ever really supported defunding the police. But that's a very different question from.
No, they didn't, but they were able to be adjacent to it. Like, the Democrats are like hippies, right? They don't have to really embrace a lot of stuff, but you can be near stuff
Yeah,
and make it seem like it's your policy, which is why, in my opinion, you're seeing almost a return to third way policy prescriptions with the Dems. Because remember, I think 3 cities defunded their police departments. Most cities didn't. And in the major cities where there was big protests, Minneapolis, where that really caught on fire, they didn't defund a damn thing. And the citizens said, please don't defund a damn thing. Because they were supposed to abolish the entire police force. Remember, the city council came out and said, we're going to abolish the police force. And then the mayor was like, nah, fuck that. And then people was like, we're not going to vote for you if you don't abolish the police force. All right, fine. and nothing happened, right? Um, then you have San Francisco and LA didn't abolish or defund anything. If anything, a lot of officers quit around COVID time. But as far as like defunding, it just didn't happen. But the Democrats were near it. They're kneeling in kente cloth. So it gives the appearance sometimes that they're on board with you because they'll give you that rhetoric that says, I feel your pain. Police are overstepping their bounds. This is a problem. We can't have young black men getting stepped on by society. Let's outlaw the chokehold. And it's like, well, chokehold's been outlawed in most states forever,
yeah,
right? That's why they have batons so they can beat the shit out of you. There's a reason why they have batons and the
yeah,
tasers,
yeah.
right? So why do you want to brag about this?
I didn't get all that from the kente cloth.
It's
I like
to
to think
say
I'm
it's to say
eager
I'm in
to.
solidarity with you, kind of. But to me, solidarity means I see you, I hear you.
Could you imagine if Trump came out in a kente cloth?
Get ready.
Dude,
Get ready.
I feel like what's the
G-
difference between that and
Get
you
ready. Joe Biden says what? We don't do a lot of electoral politics on the show, but I think we need to talk about this because it's important to understand
Oh,
why.
there was one more thing before I lose
Sure, I'm
the
sorry.
thought.
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I did just wanna make this point about another thing in the introduction was about how, uh the heavier policing policies are largely credited, I think was the phrase, with the reduction in crime over the decades since their implementation. And we don't have to get into this right this second. We could come back to it as well if you'd like, but just wanted to note that I'm skeptical. I'm not saying that it's not widely credited that way, but I think it's important to note the arguments against that position, because I do think it doesn't hold up well that the heavier policing policies are to credit for lower national crime rates. over time, particularly by now.
Well, I mean, you can just look at the 90s to now, right?
Mhm,
Pre 94, a city like New York is clocking in at what, 300 or no, 2,200 murders a year.
mhm. Yeah, and I think it had an impact. I'm not saying that it is, you know, not relevant or something, or didn't have an impact. I guess that a couple things come to mind. One is that I think when we talk about this, we're largely talking about two things, which are deterrence and recidivism. Those are the main uh, arguments for why heavier policing, I think, would reduce crime. But if you look at state by state, the states with the harshest crime policies, they don't have the lowest crime rates. They often don't even have the lowest violent crime rates. Sometimes it's the opposite, depending on the year and the place and everything else. Um, and they also don't have the lowest recidivism rates. And so there's an open question as to whether uh, you know, as to the degree to which I should say that harsher crime policies result in a reduction of crime by now. And the other thing I think it's important to point out is that since crime is continually going down, at a certain point, one would think that at least after a decade or two, there would be start to be fewer people in prison consistently. Um,
But would you make the correlation though that crime is going down because there are more people in prison? Or are you making the correlation that there's some other magical there's not more jobs.
right. I guess I
There's
would make the correlation that that the fact that there are more people, if crime is continually going down, after a certain point, it makes less sense to me why
mm,
the amount of people in prison continues to go up. Uh,
I mean, I'd have to look at the numbers because I don't know the numbers of people that were in prison in the
People are
90s and
committing fewer
2000s.
crimes, in other words.
Because
But
again,
eventually fewer people in prison.
I'm only going from what I know about the state which I'm from,
Sure,
and I
same.
know that in the 2010s, a lot of people did get out of prison because prisons were overcrowded and people were literally dying in prisons, and that's when you see a lot of laws change and you get a lot of reforms for, like, larceny
Mhm.
and a lot of try to reforms 3 strikes because it did fail, right, in that regard, because you were locking a lot of people up.
Sure, but
I'm
still.
saying you're locking a lot of people up, and the world they're coming back to is a little different because you also we're not just locking people up for 18 months.
Mhm.
That is why you get these
Of
harsher
course.
crimes because 3 strikes comes about during I don't know if you remember a
Mhm.
young woman named Polly Klaas, young woman, she was like 12. She got killed. A man broke into her parents' house during a slumber party and kidnapped her, and this is bad. She got murdered, and it became a big story. And this was, I think Clinton was already in office at this point, or he was coming into office at this point. And it was kind of a rallying cry because the man that kidnapped her had a very long rap sheet of violent crimes. So the whole thing was, we're letting off violent criminals. And this had been a talking point for probably over 10 years. Like you can go back and find people like Joe Biden on the steps of Congress saying, I don't care what your background is, we need to lock you up. And judges used to have a lot more freedom to not put people in prison for long periods of time.
Mhm.
During something called the Satanic Panic, a fear that judges were letting out sexual criminals too early caused there to be reforms to give district attorneys more power in sentencing, which really gets ramped up again in the later 80s and early 90s with the 94 crime bill. So I do think there is a correlation to locking people up because we were locking people up for longer periods of time. And the world they come back to is not a world they could just easily insert themselves back to where they were. So if you were you know, gang banging in the 90s, 2000s, it's a different world. You can't
Oh,
just what drug are you going to sell that you could sell the same way you did in the 90s, 24 hours a day? The
true.
pharmacy's open.
Yeah.
That's the hot thing right now.
Yeah.
So your illicit market just isn't there the same way. I see the correlation to a bigger homeless population.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
You, you
Absolutely.
know, th- that doesn't just grow out of nowhere,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's another aspect I would wanna get into, but I do still think it's important that on a state by state comparison, there's not a consistent correlation between, higher deterrence and lower recidivism, uh, with, um, with harsher policing. Um, but that is another point you just made that is really important is, like, um, when we think about, uh what types of crimes are investigated and
Mhm,
prosecuted and convicted, um, typically, it's what we call one-on-one crime,
mhm,
which is like, one person committing a crime, selling a drug or hurting somebody or something. Um, and there is a high correlation between poverty and one-on-one crime, the types of crimes that are prosecuted the most.
mhm.
Or even investigated or policed the most. And by all measures, going to prison makes you poor.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so,
Instantaneously. Yeah.
and so I think that is one explanation for the uh, continuously high, or at least unaffected recidivism rates by uh, by harsher policing and imprisonment. But yeah, I mean, of course, you go to prison for not even too long, you can lose everything. You can lose your job, your apartment, whatever you had. Um, and so that's a huge factor. And I think that was the only other point I had. I had some notes, but I think I forgot something. But just wanted to throw that out there.
I mean, I'm not trying to say that you need to lock people up to make the world a better place because I don't think the 90s and 2000s were a better place. This is a different time.
Yeah,
But a lot of people that lived that were doing shit that might have got them a few years or 18 months or even probation, you were getting thrown under the jail.
yeah,
You were getting kingpin sentences. I mean, we're still seeing that to this day with people making bathtub meth to support their own habit, getting kingpin charges.
yeah.
That's a problem because these aren't kingpins. These are people selling drugs to ultimately, you know, stay afloat and keep their habit going. That's not a kingpin in any stretch of the imagination.
Mhm.
I think movies have really infected our brains in the way that we see criminal behavior. I see these movies about crime in Mexico and it's extravagant. And I don't think people know what the average little narco looks like, but it definitely doesn't look like the movies.
Mhm.
You know, these are kids.
Yeah. And on the point of homelessness too, and the policing of homelessness, this is another a theme I think you'll find a lot in coverage about these issues throughout the media, and also throughout local and national political discussions, often local ones. About police is, and this comes up in Jeffrey Ryman's book. It's either Riemann or Ryman. I don't know how it's pronounced, but the rich get richer and the poor get prison, which is a legal text from I think the first edition was published in the late '90s, um, and so it's sort of about the era that you're talking about, in which these policies were implemented, the first kind of phase of it. And he points out in the book that when crime is low, we're told that we need to get more police because they're keeping crime low. They're doing a good job keeping crime low. And when crime is high, we're told we need more police because the crime is too high. And certainly that comes up a lot in local discourse about the homeless issue, and people see more and more people that make them uncomfortable out in the community. They call for heavier policing because it's gotten out of control. And then if ever there's a period of, which these days there really isn't, but whenever there's a period of, I guess, relative calm or less of that. Saw a little bit of it in the motels when the motel programs opened, because those people weren't on the street anymore. And it was funny to me, some of the people in the community in the beginning who were opposed to opening the motels to all these homeless people were the same people who were complaining about the fact that they'd been out on the street all this time. They don't like seeing them on the street. They don't like seeing them in front of their businesses. But all of a sudden there's an opportunity for all of them to have a place to go, and you don't want that either. And so, but so when they were put up in the motels, there, I think, was a period where people just weren't seeing each other as much, and, but they call for heavier policing when it's calmer as well. When the crime rate goes down, they call for it. When it goes up, they call for it.
I mean,
That win, you lose.
I'm real big on coverage influences people. And when the coverage was George Floyd, which I believe in the 3 months after his murder was viewed over 1 billion times. That's a lot. And there was multiple things happening. I don't think George Floyd happens in a vacuum, meaning a lot of people have gotten their ass kicked and killed by police. Philando Castile, to me, is one of the most egregious things that we've seen, not that's been documented, that we've literally seen, where a man that's, from what we understand, kind of a pillar in his community, in the car with his chick and the chick's kid, abides by the law, knows how it's supposed to go down, and is doing everything step by step procedurally, and is still murdered. Yeah. The city didn't blow up like it did under George Floyd. We kind of have to ask ourselves, well, why? So we got Trump in office that's saying the most amazingly racist shit after things like Charlottesville, very nice people on both sides. You have this coverage of this small fringe group called Proud Boys, and now everybody's worried about white dudes and Puerto Ricans in polo shirts. You're in places like Orange County, which has never really been a racial melting pot, so to speak. There's protests to build walls and hate Latin people and all this other crazy shit. These are relatively smaller things, but still, they're making national news. We're all stuck inside of a house. We're all terrified of what we don't understand. We've made masking a partisan issue. Wherever you stand on it, I just don't care. But it became a partisan issue. So people are pretty angry. And to watch ad nauseum this man, and to know about the Breonna Taylor thing where the police went into the wrong house on a no-knock warrant. And that wasn't the first time that's happened in the last few years, where the wrong person has been shot on a no-knock warrant. But the coverage became police misconduct. This person got roughed up by a cop, because news people have scanners. They know what's going down. And that was the coverage. The coverage was the protests. It became the language for a while until it wasn't. And like I had feared, and like other people had talked about, was that if you get a Democrat in office, regardless of who it was going to be, this could have been Pete Buttigieg, it wouldn't have mattered. You get a Democrat in office, the coverage is going to shift. Didn't know what it was going to shift from. Also, Trump's presidency starts off with the Remain in Mexico policy and kids in cages. There were so many people barreling down to the border when that happened to try to help those children. I live near the border. Ain't nobody coming down to help them people now. You think there's not families down there? I see them on a daily basis. They're not Mexicans. They're coming from places like Guatemala. And they're there with their babies. That same support isn't there because the coverage isn't there. And I don't think we view it the same way. And what's been going on over the last, I would say, 2.5 years or so, especially during the pandemic, is the coverage is, look at these kids stealing. They're going into a store and they're smashing and grabbing and they're stealing. Well, smashing and grabbing in jewelry stores in major metropolitan areas is something that's been going on since there's been jewelry stores in major metropolitan areas. Stealing from a shopping mall is something that many of my friends did, and I can't sit here and lie to you and anyone watching and say something I didn't do in my youth.
Yeah.
But the conversation has changed from law enforcement accountability, overstocking prisons, the failure of these policies. It wasn't that long ago that everybody was reading The New Jim Crow. It wasn't that long ago that Ava DuVernay was winning awards for like stuff like When They See Us, the movie about the Central Park Five.
Yeah.
Gone. It's all gone. Now the coverage is, remember those 5 little black kids? Well, here's 5 more black kids breaking into a cell phone store to steal a bunch of phones that aren't operable once they walk out of the door. Why should I care about that?
Yeah.
But it becomes the conversation. I think coverage has a lot to do with the way people see these problems, because you're not lying when you're talking about crime going down. Before we did the show, I was up to about 2 a.m. my time. I just wanted to go over some statistics to see if some numbers were going down. And in bigger cities, numbers are going down, even for things like property crime. New York is seeing, on the whole, I think there's different, boroughs that are experiencing their problems, but on the whole, they're even seeing things like auto theft go down. But still, we're talking about a fear people have, and how much of that fear you have is built into what you're seeing through the media. I live in a place that my American friends think is a violent place. I don't lock my door. I barely lock my car door. I leave my cell phone in my car when I go to the downtown in my city, and sometimes forget to lock my door. And nothing happens to my stuff. It's extremely safe. I don't really see fights out here. But the news coverage I get, when I go back to the Bay Area where I'm from, is bipping. Everybody's windows broke out. But, I had my car broke into when I was 19 years old in San Francisco. That's almost 30 fucking years ago.
Yeah.
So has it really changed? Or is it just the way we see the coverage that makes us feel like there's a change?
It's another interesting aspect of all this. People in the United States are, for some crazy stretch of years, might still be ongoing, were polled on the question of whether they thought crime was going up. And every single year, Americans think crime is going up, which is, I guess, impossible. And so, yeah, that's a major aspect of this, is just the way that people think about it. I had another thought there, but I lost it.
Oh.
It's all right. Oh, shit. I got hit with the music, dude. Promised myself I wouldn't get hit with the music, dude. Dude, I once called into Knicks Fan TV because I'm a Knicks fan, and they took my call, and I had so much to say that they had to play me out with Oscar music.
You went over your 10-second speech. It's
Yeah.
okay. It's okay. You know why?
Fire rap.
Because I wrote a bunch of talking points and questions down.
All right.
Hold on. I have them right here on my screen. Um, Here's one that I think originally we were going to start the show off with this. There is a measure in California called the Homelessness, Drug Addiction, Retail Theft, and Reduction Act. I'm going to say that again for the listeners. Homelessness, drug addiction, retail theft reduction act. Just all those words together sounds like a comedy bit. I got a Jew. I got the Irish.
Yeah, again, replace that word homeless with any.
Right?
See
How do these things? Why do you want a bill for retail theft reduction? That's not the citizen's problem. That's okay, but I'm going to finish reading. This bill would roll back a 2014 law by increasing penalties for fentanyl dealers and repeat organized retail theft rings. Recently, Matthew, a white woman, I didn't believe this was real. I saw some like Instagram reel on it, and I've had to find like real stories on it. This happened in like San Diego County, which is just north of me here in Baja. But she had people stealing from like Sephora's and some other beauty stores all over the country, and she would pay people to go in there and just grab stuff. And she had in her house a warehouse full of stuff that she was selling on Amazon.
Dude, you got to kind of admire that, right?
She was doing this for like 10 years. For like 10 years, she had a whole. And what sucks about this is because I'm gonna play the race card. I'll give myself the because she is white, she's gonna get an Orange is the New Black type, show about her being some sort of fucking girl boss.
Hey,
Right.
she put her mind to something. Whatever happened to steal a little and they throw you in jail, steal a lot and they make you a king,
It depends who you are, right?
Yeah, I guess that's
you find out how much of a pro you are when, regardless of how lily white this woman is white. I'm talking like bedazzled jeans, big SUV, PTA mom, white, Nancy Grace watching ass, fucking has a kid named Jaden.
Jeez.
Extra caramel in the Starbucks white, right? She went down. They raided her house, cuffed her and the husband up, took all the shit. I was rather amazed. I think it was a 3 or 4 state ring she had where she had people that would get shit and they would mail it to a mailbox. And there was I was trying to figure out what law enforcement agency was tasked with finding her, because sometimes there's these alphabet agencies that get involved in this. I think just a snitch snitched her out. That's generally how you worked in prison.
That's an interesting question, is how she got caught.
Yeah, you worked in prisons. It's not
I didn't.
crack work. Or not. You talk to people. That's what I mean. I didn't mean like, hey.
I misrepresent myself here.
Work with people in prisons.
Yeah.
But when you talk to them, it's not like it was crack police work that got it. It wasn't Mel Gibson and Danny Glover figuring out the breaking the code. It's like somebody told. How'd you get caught? Somebody told. Everybody tells, by the way.
Dude, also, one last thing on that. Fuck Amazon, dude. Dude, I'm with the mom on this one.
Amazon is fencing stolen merchandise constantly.
Jeez.
Constantly.
Wow.
Is anything ever going to happen to Amazon? You wanna get stolen there's
Well,
2 places to get great stolen shit. Amazon is probably the best because at least with eBay, depending on what you're buying, there's serial numbers involved, right? You think Amazon is checking serial numbers for stolen lipstick?
right. I mean,
No.
also, uh, the other thing with this all is that, like, like I was talking about before about the one-on-one crime being really the only thing we prioritize mainly in American policing. You don't really, so we're not. The other consequence of that is, I would argue, we're not really investigating or prosecuting the worst crimes. Like
Rapes?
Yeah, rapes are, but rapes would still count as a one-on-one crime.
Okay.
So I would say things like, pollution that like makes whole communities sick, or war crimes maybe would be a good one too. Uh, um, I think it was Jeremy Scahill said it says a lot about a society when your whistleblowers are in prison and your war criminals are on book tour.
Oof.
Uh,
Oof.
And, I think that's right. And I would also add, this is, I think, very far afield. I'm not an economist or anything. I maybe shouldn't even speak on these issues, but, you know, it has crossed my mind as somebody who doesn't make a lot of money myself, has to work, pretty hard
Mhm.
to do what I do. Um, when I see every few weeks or couple months an announcement of this amount of billions of dollars is going to this country, this amount of billions of dollars is going to Israel, or
Mhm.
it's like, you guys just got billions and I gotta work at this place. Like, can I get in on that? Like,
On the billions?
at
No, you're
least
in the
spot
wrong
me
field.
at least spot me at 20, you know? Look, dude, like, I'll get you back next April, you know?
Can you just make McDonald's cheaper?
Yeah. No, I'll get you back next April. Yeah,
I'll get you back next April.
yeah.
Um, but
Israel,
back but
you're gonna pay it back.
but back to the Homelessness, Drug Addiction,
Yes.
Retail Theft Reduction Act. This bill would roll back a 2014 law by increasing penalties for fentanyl dealers and repeat organized retail theft rings, as well as providing mandatory treatment for drug users. According to the proposed ballot initiative, the law would also include a measure that would add previous theft charges to reach the felony threshold. So the felony threshold in California for larceny is 950, and they want to lower it to 450. That's where it was. Just so people know, that's uh lower than Texas.
Wow.
Texas is 500 for grand larceny. In 2020, Californians voted against reforming or changing the 2014 law because of fears of mass incarceration. I'll repeat that again. In 2020, coverage, Californians voted against reforming or changing the law, in, the 2014 law, because of fears of mass incarceration. Now, with over 360 signatures, it looks to make the November ballot. Matthew, why the change in attitudes with voters? Have they forgotten mass incarceration?
Well, it's an interesting question because, mass incarceration, like, they talk about a fear of it, like it could happen, but it's obviously a huge problem already. Um, I think, I think people are pretty reactive. I also think people are pretty isolated from people in prison. They just don't really think about people in prison. I mean, at least with homeless people, they think about them enough to realize that they don't like them, you know. But people in prison, they're just isolated, I think, from people who don't have direct experience, don't have friends or family who are in prison, or, never had experience with it themselves. I think that could explain changes in public attitudes. But I also think, I question how much public attitudes have changed and how many are just are louder and more accepted than they were when all this was going on. And I also think there's a lack of understanding of uh, of how prisons do and don't help the problem.
Mhm.
Christine Montross is. I mean, we discussed earlier how there's a link between poverty and one-on-one crime, but our solution to that is something that makes people poorer. And the same thing is true with other problems that cause people to commit one-on-one crimes or get arrested for committing one-on-one crimes. Um, so uh, mental people with mental health issues is one, and all the research clearly shows that not only are they more likely to be incarcerated, but once they're incarcerated, their mental health issues become worse. And then you also have people who didn't have mental health issues before get incarcerated, and then they develop mental health issues. I've had prisoners describe their experience in Alabama prisons to me as like having been in a war zone. Um, and and I mean, there's also another case of, I can't remember the guy's name. A couple of decades ago, there was a guy who we now know to have been wrongly convicted of the crime he was in prison for. But some amount of years into his sentence, he killed somebody in prison. Felt threatened, was in some situation where he, if I remember correctly, acted out of self-defense, but he murdered, he went to prison and murdered someone. So even when his conviction that he was sentenced for initially was overturned, he stayed in prison for that. Um, and so uh, there are many issues that relate very much to crime, and policing and prisons uh, make all of them worse. And so if the only solution to that, if we're going to keep using prisons and policing as the solution, is you just keep them locked up for as long as you can, and then you're getting into question of just you know treating people in a crazily inhumane way.
Yeah.
um uh, and so I think there's a lack of understanding about that, of the consequences of putting people in prison, who ends up being put in prison. Also, the other thing is that research shows that one-on-one crimes. I mean, first of all, we should mention that I think the last number I've seen is something like over 70% of Americans are in prison for nonviolent crimes. Uh, and so the types of crimes, the types of communities that are policed are based on class and race. Those are the two main correlations. That's where the police are. The research consistently shows, at this point, it's actually even kind of a cliche to cite it because people say it all the time. But it actually, I do think one of the first places it came up was in that book I mentioned earlier, that that whites and blacks use drugs at similar rates,
Yeah.
and blacks and possess drugs at similar rates, and blacks are incarcerated at much higher rates. And at the time of that book, I think there are even a couple drugs where the research suggested whites might be using it more
Mhm.
and getting incarcerated less. I might have that a little wrong, but I think powder cocaine, that was the case of. I could be wrong about that. But even in cases where white people were using the drugs as much or more, they were being incarcerated far less. Marijuana is the most famous example of that,
Mhm.
and probably was one of the most persistent for a long time. But um, so I think that's a long answer to your question, but I do think people often turn to these policies because it feels like a quick fix. It feels like it's the only solution they've ever been really informed about in many cases. And sometimes maybe they just are like particularly frustrated with their particular neighbor and they just want something done. Uh, I think that like calling the police often is a way to sort of displace interpersonal problems one has on to another party. Just sort of get somebody else to deal with it for you. Um,
I mean, would you say that sometimes there's problems outside of your control that might need something beyond you to fix, right? Like this isn't there's a difference between some kids having band practice in the garage next door and I don't know, maybe hearing somebody kick their wife's ass
Of
or,
course. Yeah,
you
and
know.
I'm not like an abolish the police person
Mm.
either. I don't know, if maybe I should have made that clearer, but
No, I'm not even trying to say you are. I'm just asking the question that,
yeah.
um, are there situations where you feel, and I'm asking this question to the people in the chat as well. I'm not saying, I'm not asking it because I know the answer. Are there situations where you feel that you should call the police?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, uh, threats of violence, certainly, or even, I mean, there's even smaller things, like Chomsky notes in his book on anarchism that, like, he called the police to shoot, like, a rabid raccoon that was, like, terrorizing the neighborhood. But certainly, I mean, that's a silly example, but certainly, I have, um, I I certainly in a situation where one's own safety is at risk, like the example you described. Okay, like let's take that example. I actually have like both intervened myself
Mhm.
in a situation where I've overheard like a woman being abused. And I've also called the cops in that situation. Similar things if fights break out or what, in situations around me. But I wouldn't recommend that anybody like go in and try to fix that themselves.
It's Jordan Neely, right? The young man that got killed on the New York subway when he was having an episode and someone put him in a chokehold and didn't.
Yeah, I mean, that situation is a little different where um it's my understanding is that like so with Jordan Neely, I would actually not tell people that they shouldn't engage with him. Certainly, I would tell people not to do it that way. Uh, but, uh, but it's not as clear to me, and I'm not as familiar with that case, I should say, but
Mm,
it's not clear to me that Jordan Neely was like a threat to anyone's physical safety. He wasn't like beating up a woman on the
yeah.
train. Like that's. So if it had been a situation like that, I would advise people to have professionals who can, who have have you call for emergency services for help. I would say, in that situation, I would not go it alone. I have no problem admitting that there are certainly situations in society in which one wisely calls the police.
I mean, I think that's the case.
What's that?
I'm afraid about this law because you've worked with people, you've interviewed people that are locked up over petty stuff. We still have people under three strikes that are in there for life
Mhm.
over very small thefts. And to say you're gonna add this weird addition part of the clause that says, well, if you stole, $100 here and we're gonna make sure that we can add everything up to get you to the larceny amount so we can throw you in prison for a longer time.
Yeah. Yeah, that I would argue is another major, I would say, inevitable uh, consequence or really exacerbation of a consequence that's already taking place, which is that in overcrowded prison systems, and I'm most familiar with Alabama,
Mhm.
less so California, but you do have people locked up together who obviously shouldn't be. I mean, at the time I wrote my book, Alabama's prison systems were 180% of capacity.
Jesus
Which is
Christ.
yeah, it's just, mind-blowing, 80% over capacity, and a lot of people I think this is another consequence of TV and movies. I think a lot of people think that when you go to prison, you are, like, put in a cell, and and, in Alabama, like I mean, so not just Alabama, I mean, throughout the country, I think, more prisons are general population, which means you are stacked on top of each other in these tiny little bunk beds that don't, by the way, have ladders and are often not assigned based on like which bunk you get is not assigned based on your age or whether you have any injuries or anything that like that. And you often have people sleeping in each other's beds because theirs isn't open. There's so many people in there. I've had prisoners tell me that in certain instances during certain months there were more people than beds. Um, but the point I was trying to make was that I have interviewed, you know, first of all, multiple people throughout the same prisons in different parts of the prisons. I've also interviewed people in different prisons, often independent of each other. And there's also been times where I interviewed a couple people in the same tier of a prison, and the one would be in there on like assault, kidnapping, and robbery charges, and the other one, this is a real example, was in there for marijuana possession
Mhm.
with that guy, and luckily, having interviewed them both, I'm a strong believer in rehabilitation. I believe you know, they're both decent human beings, like worthy of at least livable treatment. But uh, but nonetheless, like that's a crazy model where you have there's almost no order to it at all. You can get caught with pot in Alabama and end up sharing a bunk bed with a guy who assaulted and kidnapped somebody.
Mhm.
And that's a real consequence of a bill like this. It's inevitable. You're going to have people who don't belong in there among the people they're around. And interestingly, that prisoners I've talked to prisoners who describe talking about that amongst each other. Like, how'd you get this much time? And I got this. Like, you know
Mhm.
what I mean? Like, that doesn't make sense. And often it has to do with race and class, but often it just seems arbitrary. Often it has to do with the crimes they committed.
Yeah.
How am I in here almost as long as somebody who did this way more terrible thing?
Well, I mean, there was an article in the LA Times a year or so ago. We did a show about it too, about how red counties in California with tough on crime DAs, tough on crime judges, tough on crime sheriffs have the highest murder rates. A tough on crime state is New Mexico, and that's, I think, the most violent state in the union
Yeah,
as far as property crime and
that
murder rates,
maybe.
right? But
Uh,
also, if you look at it, it's also a place where there's not a lot of opportunity.
it's
That's
higher in Oklahoma City than New York.
Yeah, I mean, also too, you have to look at these places like what's the opportunity? Where's the jobs? What's
Mhm.
the industry?
Right.
We don't really ask these questions. We don't talk about jobs programs at all when we think of recidivism. We almost want them to play midnight basketball and just be good people. Um, and that's insane. Also, when we talk about this homelessness retail theft reduction act, there's never a plan to really reintegrate people back into society. And it's almost as if we've accepted the fact, and it almost feels like caste when you have a prison conviction. 'Cause there's not too much you can do with the prison conviction. In
Yeah,
California, you can get a degree in prison, and you can work in the nonprofit sector.
and even that's uncommon, you know?
You know, like I said, that's why I stayed, right? Because not every state
Yeah,
is going to be as lenient as that and give you those things. Um, but if you have a conviction, there's gonna be a hard time finding a place to live. It's gonna be a harder time trying to find work because you're going to be working. You're not just part of the surplus army of labor, but again, you're kind of part of an unwanted caste of person that no longer has an entryway into a decent union job.
mhm.
You might be able to get into certain trades, but depending on how much time that's been taken away from you for whatever crime you've been convicted of, It might be harder to get into carpentry in your 40s.
Mhm.
You know, being a carpenter's apprentice or a construction worker apprentice in your 40s and 50s is really difficult.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and not everybody wants you.
Mhm. Yeah, and I would also say too, like you had mentioned this correlation with poverty too, and I think that's a huge. That's another. I mean, I've heard people argue this. I don't know if I agree with it because of the economic aspect, but another thing that correlated with crime going down in the '90s was the economy was doing well for a
Yeah,
period. I mean, people argue, I think correctly, that it was temporary because it was
very temporary because of
built false credit, but um,
still.
yeah.
I a
But
hey,
the other thing is that
I hired criminals during that time, so
the black community in America did not share in the benefits of that economic boom in the '90s, and we also saw that they were disproportionately imprisoned during that same time,
mhm.
you know?
Well, that was my point about the whole locking people up. You know, a lot of people got locked up. I would push back a little bit on that because that also was a moment where we see this kind of boom in black wealth due to home ownership. I think we just see it sucked away so quickly due to two things, right? You know, kind of scandalous. Um, what's the word? What's the word I'm
Lending,
looking? So
predatory.
yeah, the predatory lending, right, on segments of the black community, where you're paying either adjustable rate mortgages that are going to adjust like crazy, and there's no saving you from that, or also buying things with no money down when you're buying on the higher end of crazy inflation. um, that's another reason why I think economists are kind of full of shit because no one really talked about the insane inflation in home values because home values is what we use in this wonderful capitalist system that makes people feel like they have arrived. So if you bought a home in Jesus, most states in the early 2000s, you were walking into equity within a couple months, which was unheard of before, especially the 90s when interest rates were at like all-time highs. So as you get out of 94 and we get to the end of the 90s when interest rates start to lower, by the time we get to the 2000s, interest rates are relatively low from where they had been 10 years prior.
Mhm,
And that was making home values increase tremendously. So you could leave the hood, quote unquote, and go into the suburbs. So, you know, people sold family homes that some of them were owned outright
mhm,
to increase their debt load for larger homes that, they then lost.
mhm,
And I don't think we really covered that or really understand how tragic that loss is,
mhm,
especially when we think about things like drug use and the unhoused. Growing up in an area like the Bay, Oakland, and Richmond, where I'm from, there was just family homes that people had because these are places where, if you've seen movies like Boys in the Hood, I grew up in an area that looks something like that, where there's a lot of homeowners. There's also some crime, but these are family homes that no one's trying to get rid of. With
mhm,
that boom, that felt like opportunity for a lot of people because,
mm,
again, there was no economist telling you that this is just inflation and this market may be problematic.
yeah,
Those warnings were very, very quiet and they were kind of kept out of mainstream press. No one's reading the back page of a Wall Street Journal to hear what Elizabeth Warren is saying about mark to market economics or
mhm,
derivatives markets, right?
mhm,
So um, now these areas where people kind of still have some family or ties to, um, they sold their family home.
mhm,
Or if they didn't own their family home got sold from them. And just to see this rash of young homeless people was shocking for me to see in East Oakland. I was
yeah,
like, wow, what is this coming? You talk to people and you find out it's like, damn, people lost everything during the 2006,
yeah,
2007, 2008 crash.
yeah,
And we act as if it's all good now.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing, this bill I'm talking about, is a reflection of 2008, of that crash.
Yeah.
You know, we're not going to have 1929 again, but we kind of have 1929 again. We're just going to cover it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would. Oh, there was something else I wanted to say about how this relates to homelessness. Something about that bill. I can't remember. Again, too much work. Oh,
That's
uh,
why you see. That's why you know, when Matt came on, Pascal was here, and because we were going to do another show, and Daniel Tutt had to reschedule, and I was like, "Oh, Pascal, you don't have to be here." He was like, "All right, cool, I'm gone," because he knew there was reading involved, and he didn't do the reading.
and no, I'm super happy to be here. I meant my too much work during the week, but yeah, I can't remember what I was gonna say there. Yeah, lost it again. Sorry, man.
Well, no, I just want to bring that up because, you know, during Obama, I think when you have this massive crash that was frightening, I lost everything. We ring it in with this black president and hope.
Oh, I remember what I was gonna say.
That's all. So that's it, black president. You're like, and that's why.
Oh man, no, it was just that, like, it's a really simple point, which is just like a lot of people ask, like, why are there homeless people? Like, why are there all of a sudden homeless people in my community? And like, people often ask me, having interviewed so many people, like, why do people end up homeless? You know, like as if there's just one answer. And you know, obviously, one thing you learn pretty quick from interviewing people is that they all get there a different way. There's some similarities. Pretty much all of them suffer some type of tragic series of unfortunate events before or during their homelessness. But another thing is just like uh, housing is really expensive,
Yes.
you know, and it's kind of crazy that, like, I mean, I don't make a lot of money. Most of it goes to rent, I think, you know. Certainly that's my biggest expense. And and it's a pain in the ass every month, you know. Like, it's not hard for me to imagine how somebody couldn't keep up with that, you know. I've failed to do it uh or several times in my life, you know.
Yeah.
Uh and um And so, yeah, I think it's as long as the cost of housing in all forms is so high, it's a little bit weird for people to be going around so puzzled about why there's so many unsheltered people. You know, I think one
Again,
of the amazing questions is why there aren't so many more.
well, here's the thing. Counts. I don't know if you've ever been a part of a
In
count.
time counts, the pit counts.
You ever been part of a homeless count for an area, for a city?
No, I haven't, but I've written a little bit about them, and we have to use them where I work annually. We refer to them.
You know,
They're extremely unreliable.
it's extremely unreliable because there's so many people. Like before I came to Mexico, there was about a 2, maybe 3 month period where I was unhoused. I was crashing on a couch, so technically I'm housed, right?
Right.
But
I
no,
just went through a couple months like that. Yeah.
yeah. I had very wonderful friends. Shout out to Tasha and Aubrey, who kept TIR alive. They made sure I had a space to keep doing this show and do some writing and even some music recording. So shout out to them for it's a blessing to have good friends. Before I was able to come down here and kind of afford to live Um, People don't like to talk about that correlation because I think it messes with the idea that we have. We have a very moralizing opinion of people in general, right? Um, and the thing about a lot of these laws and the way they're perceived is we talked about this on the show with Toure Reed on Thursday. There's a lot of underclass ideology that becomes a part of the conversation. And we end up thinking about malfunctioning individuals that have a pathology. That's why mental illness, people love to throw that around because it's a generic term. If I told you that the mental illness most people suffer from is autism and how many people's kids have autism, they might look at it a little bit differently. But when you see someone talking to themselves on the street, you just assume that they came out of the womb talking to themselves. Trauma's a motherfucker. Everybody loves to speak in trauma language. You know, how many people have I met that don't want to deal with a narcissist? Or, don't say that, it's triggering. Everybody loves to speak in the language of trauma, but
Mhm.
no one wants to really deal with, well, trauma affects a lot of young people. What happens when you see a parent get their ass kicked on a daily basis? Or not even a daily basis. What happens when you see your parent get their ass kicked? What if you're the child of a parent that's in the sex industry and you're in the house when they're working, so to speak? And I'm not talking about posing for fucking OnlyFans, right?
Yeah.
And that happens to way more people than you think.
Yeah.
How does that affect you when you go to school? How can you sit down and want to listen to somebody when you know what your reality is? That's
Yeah.
trauma. What then happens to this person if they don't graduate high school? They don't get into college. Even if they do, what can they do? What job opportunities do you have for you? If maybe you don't have the basic skills to interview properly.
Yeah, I mean, there's a prisoner in my book who I interviewed. He said, "There's a phrase in here: dogs live better than we do, and if
Oof.
you treat people like dogs for long enough, they start to act like dogs." Um, and I think there's another interesting thing about particularly the homeless conversation, the discourse on homelessness. I noticed this in um, the local uh, how it came up locally where I was at the time, and I noticed interestingly a lot of the same people who explain all of homelessness by drug issues and
Mhm,
mental illness
mhm,
are also the least supportive of helping them. It's interesting because it's almost like you would think that if you believe somebody has mental health issues, uh, the solution would be to try to do something about that. But often the way that mental health issues and drug addiction are brought up is to actually paint the people as like untrustworthy, not deserving of help. It's like,
yeah.
oh, they're all mentally ill and drug addicted, therefore you shouldn't help them and you shouldn't even talk to them and don't give them money if they ask for it. You know, it seems counterintuitive. If you really believe that uh, the problem is mental health issues or drug addiction, it's I think counterintuitive to just use that as a reason to attack a person in a way that you probably wouldn't if it was somebody in your personal life or your family who's not homeless. You likely would care for them. Uh,
I mean, that's been a change for me to see here living in Mexico because there's so much multi-generational living. It's very accepted. So homelessness is something that exists here. There's also, again, a border town, so there are people that are just thrown over. It's not like I don't know if people think you get flown back to your home when you get deported, but that ain't it, as the young people say.
it comes up similarly in prisons too, where there was, I think, a time where people were starting to talk more openly about the correlation between poverty and prison. And again, the way that that's discussed is it's not that when we learn that we then have more sympathy for people in prison. It's that when we learn that now we not only blame them for being criminals, we also blame them for being poor.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
That,
and
that's the hard part, man.
yeah,
No, that's to me, that's the hard part is because
if
if
you raise
you
awareness about it, it'll have the opposite effect. People will just use it against the person. You know?
imagine if signing up, you have to register now, and imagine if registering meant you had to go work in a shelter or permanent supportive housing as a shelter monitor or something for 4 years, opposed to be part of an imperial uh, occupying force for 4 years, possibly. I think it would really change the way people see poverty, quote unquote, mental illness, what causes someone to become homeless. It's a lot of things, and you know we can maneuver around our class status here and there, but when it came to something like the economic crash for me, I was thrust right back to where I quote unquote belonged before I knew it. I got to spend, I don't know, maybe almost 10 years feeling what it was like to have some money, and then it was all gone, and I didn't have a safety net. I don't have rich parents. Like, my father is in a facility um, for dementia, and his
Mhm.
house got sold, so we don't have a family house.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a lot of people like that. There's also people on the fringes that, again, this is back when we talk about what are some of the problems. There's so many people now because we don't have as many facilities. They're all private for things like dementia and Alzheimer's. So if you take off work to take care of a family member, and if that family member doesn't own a home, maybe even if they do own a home, it's like, do you have the means to pay that mortgage if there is one, or pay those property taxes?
Right.
Let's say there's just not a mortgage and there's just an abundance of property taxes.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to take care of that while you're taking care of someone with these types of illness? Because you can't take care of a parent with dementia or Alzheimer's and then try to go work.
Yeah.
You just can't.
Yeah.
That's a 24-hour job,
Yeah.
and it weighs on you and it eats on you. And when it's all over, you could have spent years trying to take care of a parent if you don't have the money to put them in a facility, which are extremely expensive.
Hmm.
Um, Kind of like the boomers did with their parents, right? just shoved. Toussaint made this hilarious point. I don't remember, she made it on air. She goes, the boomers are terrified that the Gen Xers and millennials will do to them what they did to their parents and just shove them in a facility. That's why
Yes.
they're out here eating bran all the
Yeah, or
time.
their kids, if their kids were autistic or mentally challenged,
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's there's tons of ways you can lose everything and not be a drug addicted felon or mentally ill talking to invisible people. But I'll tell you what, taking care of a family member going through dementia or Alzheimer's, you know, it's hit my dad relatively early. He could live another 10 years.
Mhm.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
I can't be reintegrated back into the workforce at 56.
Mm.
The fuck job is there for me?
Mm.
It's going to pay my bills,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And also, we have to ask the question, what happens to these people if you can't afford to take work off to take care of them? It's another reason why you have some people talking themselves in the street.
Yeah.
In the facility I worked in, the majority of people were elderly.
In the world, basically. Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
how many people do you deal with that are elderly, right? Because
Yeah.
they don't have family that can take care of them.
Prison too, you know.
Oof.
I mean, it's really heartbreaking in prison. You know, I interviewed one guy was charged in Alabama as an adult when he was a minor for a crime he claims he didn't commit. There's very shoddy evidence for, but he basically had no defense. He had no legal guardian present in the courtroom. Uh, he's been in there ever since. He's older than you now, so you know, basically grew up in prison. More than well over half of his life in prison. He's got no. He's got one aunt on the outside. That's it. You know, he says his dad is out there somewhere, but he doesn't know where. Uh, and his mom was a sex worker who has passed away, and was, you know, kind of his only real, you know, uh, you know, close family relationship for a long time. And you know, he said to me once, and which is also another thing is like, uh, because of that, he also can't connect with the outside world because he has no money. He can't put any money on his phone account just because he has one, you know. But one time he'd said to me, they keep you in here. So they keep you in here until everybody in your life dies off, you know,
Ooh.
just, uh, just brutal. And yeah, so a lot of time they end up on the street and then they end up in prison. They just have nothing, you know? But yeah, there's a lot. I think that's a big part of what I encounter is just like really, really intense loneliness. You know, uh, people have just lost everybody, either you know before or as a result of the homelessness or
Yeah.
incarceration. You know, both ways for sure.
It doesn't mean it's hard to deal with someone that you don't have the capacity to deal with, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's also part of it. I mean, I don't know. It's what scares me the most, and the whole premise of this show is I remember very vividly the language of tough on crime, and I remember what it looked like. I remember how it was implemented. Um, and over the last, let's say, 15 years, it feels like people have been waking up to the error of this. And 2020 was a moment that I had a little bit of hope. And then I felt like everything became a slogan. How can I make this easy for people to understand? Like hashtag mentality post BLM is just the only way people know how to understand anything. Like, give me a hashtag understanding of it. Give me a Twitter like 128 character understanding, and then I'll. That's all every policy needs to be. That's how my understanding of the world is. I need an instant soundbite.
I think that's not a coincidence either, because one interesting thing about the Black Lives Matter protests that I actually think relates to all this, and maybe it was kind of a shortcoming of it, is that what really unified people, the content that really unified people, the information that really unified people, was something they see. You know,
Mhm.
they saw it on video if they didn't see it in the communities they lived in their lives. You know, you didn't have to, you know, and I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, I noticed this while I was writing my book on the prisons. It didn't really, you know, and correct me if, you know, or, you know, I invite you to disagree about this. I don't know if I'm right about this, but it felt like
Mhm.
it didn't really reach the topic of mass incarceration very much. It stayed very focused on policing and did not incorporate the prisoners very much. It was very much about police misconduct, and even most of the reforms proposed were policing reforms. They were not prison reforms. And so I think that was kind of a shortcoming of the movement. And I also think it's not a coincidence that you didn't have to read anything to be outraged by what happened to George Floyd. You know, you don't have to read anything to see what the police do all over the country, but you have to do some work to learn about the prison system, because there's a lot of work that's done to isolate it from us, to so that we don't have to see it. And you have to talk to people who there's a lot of work done to make unavailable and just completely invisible. And you don't have to do that work if you want to learn about or be critical of the police.
Yeah, there's also a lot of moralizing with victims, right? Like, for a moment, George Floyd was the perfect victim in a way that Rodney King couldn't be. Rodney King spends the rest of his life after that amazing near-death ass whooping by the police being a joke, which is why I don't think he comes up much when we talk about police violence and what we've physically seen, because he spoke, and I don't know what people expected him to say. He never signed up to be the spokesperson for Black people. He never signed up to be the spokesperson for people that have dealt with law enforcement. He was just a guy, and he always wanted to be a guy. And when all the microphones were put on him, I think he gives one of the most honest, heartfelt speeches you can ever see, of someone witnessing their city burn. And it was a joke. Every comic on Def Jam and Comic View just shit on that guy so hard.
Yeah.
George Floyd didn't get that opportunity. So we could project onto him all sorts of things. And I know recently there's a comic, and I use that term extremely loosely. I don't think this dude's funny at all. That I think his name is Lucas. Is it David Lucas? That made a real effed up George Floyd joke because George Floyd went to prison for a strong arm robbery where he did put a gun to a woman's pregnant belly, I believe, and was like, "Give me all your money, I'll kill your kid," or something like that. You know, effed up shit that people say when they're doing effed up things. But he served his time. I can't look back on what he did and served his time for and still try to judge him as a man. We love giving people redemption arcs when it's convenient, but depending on what crime you do, you don't get a redemption arc
or who you are.
Yeah. And I always found that real fucked up. And then that became kind of a talking point on right-wing circles about George Floyd. Well, you know, he did this bad thing. It's like, yeah, he also served time for it. You know, what do you want? If you love prison so much, don't you want people to get in and serve their time, learn their lessons, so to speak, and get out and be contributing members of society? Or are you always that thing? And I think that's what I learned most about working in and living amongst unhoused people, is that once you go down for something, that's just what you are forever.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll just go in and out because that's just what you feel you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, let's look. I've taken too much of your time today already. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Happy to be here.
Where can people? But wait, before we go, I do want to ask you this last question.
Sure.
Do you think this election, regardless of who wins, will begin the return of mass incarceration 2.0? Joe Biden, as many know, is no stranger to wanting to lock people up. Donald Trump wants to always lock up more people than his predecessor. So what does this mean for America?
Impossible to say. I think that one thing I can say is that first of all, I'm not sure it would be 2.0 so much, or just a continuation of the mass incarceration that has consistently existed, hovering around just below or just above 2 million uh, in prison for the past couple of decades. I think that that will stay the same. There might be moments where something causes certain politicians to make certain cosmetic, superficial reforms that seem to make a much bigger difference than they actually do, but are worth doing. Um, and barring that, I think you'll just see a steady increase or consistently hold around where it is. I don't think that there's anything in the works right now that has the potential to um, substantially reduce or change, reduce the amount of people in prison, or change the prison systems, or make them more humane. Uh, uh, I just don't see anything in the making like that. And part of that, I think, is because there's not really a major social movement in place that cares about it. And these social movements that do exist around other topics that might be related in one way or another, it just doesn't come up much. I mean, Black Lives Matter being mainly focused on policing was one example. Um, and so, yeah, I wish I had like a happier thing to say at the end, except that if we want it to change, more people have to take an interest in it. Um, Very likely that nothing will change even if you do that, but certain that nothing will change if you don't. And even if nothing changes, I do think they're just having built relationships with people on the ground. I think there's some benefit to just breaking the social stigmas around getting to know people. Some of my best friends in the world, some of the people I feel closest to, some of the smartest people I know are prisoners, or most interesting people are prisoners, homeless people. Um, and I wouldn't know that if I acted like everybody else in my community. And whether I had sympathy for them or not, just didn't talk to them or make them a part of my lives or my work. So I think, yeah, removing those conventional social stigmas that are in place is helpful. Like, it would be nice to walk into a restaurant and see a mix of economic classes hanging out together inside of it, but I don't see that happening anytime soon either. But the relationships you build with people in the process of doing the work uh, will mitigate the suffering in those people's lives to some degree, even if it's just the fact that somebody gives a shit about them. And so, yeah, I think under Trump or Biden, it'll continue to get worse or stay the same. I have to think, I mean, maybe it's just that Trump is so much more out in the open about uh, the things that we oppose that he wants to do than Biden. Biden's a little smoother, at least at like paying lip service to something, while recognizing that it's important, or he cares about it, or thinks it's sad or something, while making the problem worse, and often in many of the same ways that Trump does. But I have to think that Trump is more likely to create more newer ways to go after people with the legal system than Biden. But really, I think at some level it could not be a hugely significant distinction in that area, because I do think it'll just get bad or worse under both of them. And who knows? I mean, Democrats, it's not rare for them to suddenly pass policies that are extremely punitive, and they all have relationships to all these private companies that benefit from the prison system in one way or another. They compete for bids on contracts. Usually the lowest priced, shittiest one gets the contract. Often the companies involved in that bidding is kept secret. So, and it changes all the time. So multiple companies have an opportunity to get in on it. And so there's a part of it there too, where it's just a certain level of corruption you're going to have in both parties that will not go anywhere in the next few years.
We have a few super chats that we have to get to before you leave.
Sure.
Eric H says Amazon has absolutely no anti-theft apparatus. Very true. They do not. Thank you for that super chat, Eric. Dizzle McFizzle, maybe the most famous of all chatters, says, what's the guest opinion on the hose in a state tough on crime context? Are they loyal?
The hose in a tough on crime state?
Yeah. Are they loyal?
I mean, I don't live in a tough one. I don't live in a tough on crime state, but mine are pretty loyal.
There you go, Dizzle. You wanted your question asked. We asked it.
I'll get back to you. I'll have to do some research.
You have to do some whole loyalty research.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do I have you for a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Let me see if I can find this video. I have to find this video because this video is the ultimate Are They Loyal video, and I really hope that I did what I usually do and sent it to Toussaint. It's the most insane thing I've ever seen. God, I gotta find it. Here, while I look for this, tell people where they can find you.
Sure. Yeah. Right now, I'm pretty much for reasons of time and logistics, I'm mainly publishing on Substack, which is matthewvernonwhalen.substack.com. That's the Hard Times Reviewer. Whalen is spelled A-N, E-N. I won't mention any names about people getting that wrong because I don't want to embarrass Jason again. But at matthewvernonwhalen.substack.com, I write essays, journalism, op-eds, book lists, book reviews about all kinds of different topics. Do a lot of work about the death penalty that I didn't mention, that I didn't get into today, but you can find that there. And then my book on the prisons, my most recent book on the prisons, is called Doing Time: American Mass Imprisonment Pandemic. And you can get that online on Amazon, I guess. Please don't try not to buy a stolen copy, I guess I should say. And certainly if anybody, wanted a copy of that book and faced any, can't afford it or whatever, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to make it available to anybody.
Sadly, I can't find this video, but it's the funniest thing I've ever seen. It's a dude. I think it's one of those Tubi movies, one of those black Tubi movies, and the dude is walking. He comes home, and his wife is just getting piped.
Oh shit!
And he opens the door, like he can hear it, but the sounds she's making are just like, it's those sounds where you're like, "Ooh, I've never heard her do that." And then he peeks inside, and he goes, "Oh!"
Yeah.
I have to find it. I thought I sent it to Toussaint. I will find this Tubi movie clip because it's the best. It's the best. Are they loyal? It's the best. Are they loyal ever?
Yeah.
It's just the piping was insane. It was if I would have walked in on that, I just would have clapped.
Yeah, right.
Bravo, sir. You are a coxman.
Oh man.
So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I should also say, if you can afford it, to people, if you could afford it, it would be awesome if you could become a paid subscriber. But there is a free version of the Substack as well.
You guys gotta help man out.
Dude, I'm telling you,
He's
yeah,
not wearing pants underneath
it's
there. That
rough.
was his best shirt. He's got no pants on.
It is my best shirt. I got my Buzz Lightyear PJs on underneath here. Uh, dude, I'm struggling. Struggling. The more you want me to write, the more you should subscribe.
Yes, please get Matt some real pants so he can stop showing up in sweats.
Exactly, dude. I'm not even actually in Vermont. I just didn't want to show up in person. Got no clean pants, dude. Buddy, you know what? It costs $8 for Jason to do a load of laundry right now.
Mhm.
That's the exact cost of 1 month.
For the cost of a load.
Yeah, dude. You give me one subscriber, I'll send you $8 so he can do his laundry too. Yeah, or I'll give you 4, that way we can both get
We
started.
can both. Please.
Second one, we do the dry cycle.
Please, someone help this white man get khakis.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Even some like old khakis with pleats. He'll even take pleats.
Right. Exactly.
You know?
I'll also accept New York Knicks tracksuits. That'd be
Are you a Knicks fan?
Yeah, dude.
Oh, it's been a long drought for you, huh?
Really rough life, dude.
Oh.
You thought you had a tough upbringing. I'm a Knicks fan, dude. I'm a Knicks fan, dude. It's been rough the whole time.
The whole time.
And I'm surrounded by Celtics fans to make it even worse.
Ooh.
Dude, they call it a fan. That's not a fan, dude. If you're a Celtics fan, your life is easy, you know?
How many Celtics
They
fans?
show up for the Celtics.
How many Celtics
You're a
fans do you walk
cheerleader.
up to?
If you're a Celtics fan, you're a cheerleader. You're not a fan. Yeah, I was a fan. I was there with the Knicks in 2004. Okay, I was watching the Knicks. Right? When there was no hope.
Hey, you know, there still isn't much, but it feels better now, right? It feels better now.
I like Brunson. I like what he's got going on. I like Josh Hart.
There's
I
hope
like
now.
Drew.
Are you like a New York Giants fan for football too?
Honestly, I hate sports. And in fact, I only watch basketball when the Knicks games are on, except for old games. I watch a bunch of games from 80s and 90s. I happen to have way too much brain space taken up by like basketball history, but I can't stand the current sport.
We got to get you on the Red Zone then, our sports show that we do on Wednesdays.
Yeah, man. I could talk about old stuff or the Knicks today.
Well, Mac wants to talk about the Lakers hiring JJ Redick.
Oh yeah.
And the Celtics winning another championship. Okay, so do the white people in the area get mad when the black Celtics win?
No, they take it in stride, you know. They take it in stride. That they're fine. I think they're fine with that being what blacks are allowed to be successful at. Yeah. Yeah, send them out on the basketball court.
Because that's like New England. Pretty
Yeah.
racist.
Yeah.
But they stopped being racist when the Celtics from the new Celtics, because the 80s Celtics
A lot of white guys.
versus
I don't know.
the
Yeah,
Lakers. Look, it was Robert Parrish and Dennis Johnson, and that was it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, no, you had, what is it? Uh, Cedric Maxwell. No, that's a writer.
You're thinking of like, no, the Celtics didn't
Who
get
was the guy who won the sixth man, I think, in '84? He was like a bench player.
on the
But
Celtics.
yeah, he was such a hustle player that
You know way more than I do because I can't think
not
of
the
any
he
blacks
became the finals MVP. That was what he got.
in
Yeah.
1984.
I think so, man. Bird was on the team and everything.
We got to Google this. Somebody Google this because I believe that Boston was allowed to have two black people succeed in the 80s, and that was
And
Robert Parrish
Dennis Johnson
and
too,
Dennis
right?
Johnson.
Dennis Johnson. And yeah, wow, that really is almost it, I think. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Thank you for the super chat. Ayatollah of Kraut Rock and Rolla. Imagine being a Denver Nuggets fan before 2023 or a Broncos fan before 1997 or after 2015. I am a Broncos fan since 1987.
Yeah.
The year John Elway, the greatest quarterback to ever play the game, won the NFL's MVP, and I had to watch my Denver Broncos get demolished by the San Francisco 49ers, who
Dude,
everyone was a fan of because the Raiders had left. And I'll tell you, junior high was rough
yeah.
in 1989 after the Broncos lost 55-10.
Dude, imagine being like a Wizards fan. Whoa, like bang,
Bullets.
bang,
Yeah,
bang.
Bullets fan. Yeah.
So I guess I should remember it could always be worse, you know?
It's just as they're a Colorado Rockies fan too. Yeah, no, Denver sports was bad, but the Broncos 97, 98, 2015, Peyton Manning, Von Miller, John Elway.
Yeah.
I'm a Giants fan. Giants got I lived in the East Bay and I was a Giants fan. And when the Giants got swept by the A's with two pitchers in 89 during the earthquake, I still have friends that tease me about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Tough.
also yeah. I also get really into old boxing.
Oh, yeah. You got to come on the show then because we've been
Yeah,
talking
I
about
love it.
boxing a
Yeah.
lot too.
Yeah, I love that.
We've been talking about fighting a lot. I've been falling down rabbit holes of watching like 80s fighters of that middle class
Oh,
division.
dude, yes. That's my shit right there, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
You
like some really good
watch
boxing.
the Gotti Ward fights?
Ooh, the first time I watched that fight, I think I was flipping channels because it wasn't a pay-per-view thing. It was just on like HBO. And
Yeah.
I watched it and I was just my eyes just the whole time I was like
Yeah.
just oof.
That last one is, like, one of the craziest things I've seen in sports history, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if we're ever gonna see a fight like that.
I don't know. I think you're right.
No. Well,
I don't
also,
smoke enough anymore, though, to say,
who gets into boxing, fighting nowadays because there's so many other sports where you're not gonna get your brain beat in. My friend Bert Cooper said something funny about UFC. He said, he goes, "You look at a lot of the guys in UFC, are they really top fighters, or are they just a bunch of dudes that wanna see what it's like to get hit in the face?"
Wait, Burt Cooper, the fighter? The boxer?
No, 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 Bert Cooper, the light-skinned black dude. Very,
Oh,
very different Bert Cooper.
yeah, I love this laugh track, dude. You got these fucking sound drops. It's gold. It's super funny when you have, like, a like, I saw, like, some really contentious debate with
Mhm.
Norman Finkelstein on here once, with just in the middle, you in the background, just dropping the fucking "Oh!" Funny little, like, push button laugh track.
Hey, that's what you get here on This Is
It's awesome.
Revolution. You get a real
You'll laugh,
conversation.
you'll cry. It's got everything. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about the tears earlier, but the tears are
Yeah.
needed because I want us to have kind of in-depth, nuanced discussions about these policies that are on the board, how we're going to combat them, how we want to fight them, how we want to look at solutions. All that being said, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Oh, no, no, it's all good. Oh, I also wanted to say a
Yeah.
friend of mine and friend of show. Where did it go? That I used to do music with many moons ago recorded a new record. Coach Will. It's called The Loop Pay Fiasco. And he just sampled a bunch of dope shit and made a really cool beat record. Can you hear this?
Yeah.
I'll put a link up in the chat where you guys can find it. If you like a lot of the music on this show, I definitely learned everything from Coach Will when we were a bunch of kids trying to figure out how to sample on his first ASR. So thank you guys so much. Matt, thank you.
Thank you, bro.
Wherever you are watching or listening, I'll put some links up in the comments and the description to Matt's work. And we are out.